Tonight on First Tuesday.
Justice is all I want to see done for them to be brought back down to Dublin and to stand trial for what they did.
It was the biggest mass murder in Britain or Ireland. 33 people died. Why has nobody ever been charged?
And they shouldn't be let out with it. And this government definitely does know who done it.
Good evening. If you live in Dublin, it's possible to forget that Belfast is only 100 miles away. Daily life in the Republic is almost untouched by the terrorist violence which bedevils Northern Ireland, a fact that tourists are reassured about constantly. Ask about the Dublin and Monahan bombs of May 1974 and the response will be hazy. It was the worst atrocity of the Troubles, and yet it's almost been forgotten. No one was convicted, no one ever charged. There's been no public outcry. The grieving relatives of those killed must ask why. Was it fatalism, a feeling that Dublin at some stage was bound to get its share of the North's misery? Or was there a more sinister reason for this long silence on both sides of the Irish border? That's what First Tuesday's been investigating over many months in Hidden Hand, the Forgotten Massacre.
Through him, with him, in him, the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours, Almighty Father, forever and ever. Amen. For many of you, you come here in sadness and sorrow as you remember the Dublin victims who have been bombed in 1974. It's a day in which memories and wounds will be reopened again as we think and remember and pray for those who have died. May I join with you in offering this Mass, that the Lord will give them eternal happiness and peace, that each of us may be...
Every year, on May the 17th, a memorial service is held to honour the victims of a terrorist atrocity, forgotten by most, yet unique in the history of the Anglo-Irish conflict. 19 years ago, Ireland's dignitaries filled Dublin's Pro Cathedral to pay their respects to the victims of what remains the worst bomb outrage of the Troubles. Today, only the relatives of the dead and injured attend the ceremony.
While the choirs of heaven sing forever to your glory. Holy, holy, holy Lord, God of power and might, heaven and earth are full of your glory.
But their prayers for the perpetrators to be brought to justice remain unanswered.
So finally then to get together.
It's never too late. I would love to see justice being done and find out who bombed Dublin.
I'd like to see it exposed. I'd like to see the people who were involved in it. I'd like to see their names being brought out. Something has got to be done.
In a very special way for ourselves who mourn and pray for those people who have died so many years ago.
In 1974, the Troubles had barely touched the south. All eyes were on the latest wave of violence in the north. Then suddenly, the bomb struck central Dublin on May the 17th, 1974. It was rush hour on a Friday evening. There was no warning. The first bomb exploded in Talbot Street at 5:30 p.m. A second bomb detonated in Parnell Street. A third in South Leinster Street. Within 90 seconds, central Dublin had been devastated.
There's a man lying, his two legs were mutilated, his side of his head was literally cut off. There was a young baby. She was like a rag doll, she was all torn to pieces.
It was like a battlefield. The first thing I saw was two bodies mangled into each other. There's also a body there, and it was decapitated. With a few of them, you could just actually see the life going out of them.
I edged towards the car that was blazing, and there behind it was the car which had in fact exploded. And beside the car was a body, decapitated. And the only way in which you could possibly determine who it might have been were a couple of brown platform boots lying there with a young girl.
26 were killed in Dublin, 253 injured.
I just remember this big flash coming straight towards me. I remember lying on the ground. It'll never leave me. Never, ever, ever leave me.
They told me that was Edward. And Edward only had 24 hours to live, little Edward. And that my husband was dead. And like, I didn't even do what I'm doing now, crying. I wasn't able to cry. I just went totally and utterly numb. Like as if every living thing I had inside of me, everything I had for life just drained out of me.
Edward O'Neill was 5 years old. The extent of his injuries shocked his surgeon.
The shrapnel or metal was still sticking in my face. He said all he could see was just bare bone from right down here. He said my whole side of my face was just brought completely over. He said he could actually see the bridge of my nose, and my ear was sort of like halfway across the back of my head. They thought I was going to die on the table.
Paddy Doyle lost 4 members of his family in the Parnell Street blast. His daughter, son-in-law and 2 baby granddaughters were killed instantly.
The kids were like 2 pieces of gold. Don't think I'm really the same ever since that. I think it was the scenery in the morgue. I think that really knocked a bit out of me, you know. It was like going into a slaughterhouse. Bits of bodies everywhere. I identified the son-in-law and the 2 kids. But the daughter, I couldn't place her. But it was an awful sight to go in. When you went in, you had to step over legs and arms, whether you're putting legs and arms, just to make up a body.
90 minutes after the Dublin explosions, a 4th bomb went off in Monaghan, 70 miles to the north and just south of the border. By drawing security forces from the border, it allowed the Dublin bombers to escape north. Again, there was no warning. 7 more were killed here. In Dublin and Monaghan, 33 lay dead and nearly 300 were injured. To this day, it remains the worst atrocity of the Troubles.
To the evil men who have perpetrated these deeds, we express the revulsion and condemnation which every decent person in this island feels at their unforgivable acts. The government are as yet unaware of the identity of those responsible for these crimes.
19 years later, none of those responsible has ever been convicted. No paramilitary group has ever claimed responsibility. Nobody's been arrested. But tonight, First Tuesday reveals disturbing truths behind the Dublin and Monahan bombings, a story that's been buried for nearly 20 years. The Irish police, the Garda Síochána, carried out the official investigation into the bombings, the biggest murder hunt in their history. Most unusually, in a terrorist case, the Garda have formally cooperated in our investigation. In a series of briefings, the Garda revealed the contents of many classified files, eyewitness statements, forensic reports, and released official photographs. We also interviewed retired senior police officers, including 3 former commissioners. Those officers who did not wish to be identified allowed us to use their verbatim statements. It's now clear that within weeks of the bombings, the Garda knew how they were carried out and the identities of the leading suspects, but were powerless to do anything about it. The bombing mission started in Belfast on May the 17th, 1974. 2 cars were hijacked in the Protestant Shankhill area and a third stolen. They were later identified as the 3 Dublin car bomb wrecks. The Belfast hijackers headed south out of the city. Their job was to deliver the cars to the bomb gangs. The rendezvous took place at an isolated farmhouse in South Armagh. The bombs themselves had been stored at the farmhouse and taken down separately to Dublin. The Dublin bomb cars entered the Republic unchecked at an unapproved border crossing at Ball's Mill, an old smuggler's route. They crossed the River Boyne at Old Bridge and continued south on the back roads. There were detailed eyewitness accounts. All 3 cars were seen and remembered on their journey to Dublin, as the police files reveal. One eyewitness stated,
"I noticed another car coming towards me from the Sheep House direction. It was a peculiar shade of blue, an Austin, I think. I took the registration number as HOI 2487.
Just over 1 hour later, the same witness saw another suspicious car in the area and took the number as DIA 4063. He had seen the Parnell Street and South Leinster Street bomb cars hours before they blew up. The bombers took minor roads past Drogheda towards Dublin Airport. By 4 p.m, all the vehicles had gathered in a car park on the outskirts of Dublin. A Garda detective confirmed.
That's where they all met up. Civilian eyewitnesses who'd spotted their number plates put them on the spot. There were 3 or 4 cars met there to prime their bombs.
The bombers now had to give themselves time to reach their target streets in the city centre. As the Parnell Street bomb car arrived at its destination, it was seen by an eyewitness parked outside the Welcome Inn.
There was a vehicle parking space behind our car, but this man did not appear to want to use it. As we pulled away, this car reversed into the space that we were leaving.
It was 5:15. All 3 Dublin bomb cars were in place. Meanwhile, the Monaghan bombers stole a Hillman Minx from this Portadown car park on the afternoon of the 17th of May. An hour earlier, a church minister spotted 3 men attempting to steal a car. He later picked them out from police mugshots. All 3 were prominent loyalist terrorists from Portadown. The car was driven from Portadown through Armagh City and stopped at a farmhouse at a small village just north of the border, where the bomb was loaded and primed. The car slipped over the border at Ward's Cross, another unapproved crossing used by smugglers. A blue car, almost certainly the getaway vehicle, was seen following the bomb car in the town centre. It left the Republic at the Tiholin customs post 5 minutes before the bomb exploded in Monaghan. Everyone who had seen the Dublin and Monahan bomb cars was shown official police photos. The result was a list of suspects, 8 faces and 8 names. This was a significant early breakthrough for the Garda. All 8 were members of the Ulster Volunteer Force, a loyalist terrorist group, and all 8 were members of its Mid-Ulster Brigade based in Portadown, County Armagh. All the eyewitnesses we contacted reaffirmed their original statements. 2 of the 8 suspects they identified closely resembled bomb car drivers. David Alexander Mulholland for Dublin and Samuel Whitten for Monaghan. In both cases, police had 3 separate eyewitnesses who identified them from photos as drivers of the bomb cars. Police confidence was high. Says one Garda officer who worked on the investigation.
We had no doubts that these people at least had a case to answer. We could have taken them to court with such positive identification. It was more than just one person picking out a photo. It was good, strong evidence.
The Garda then extended their list of suspects with 12 further names based on their intelligence sources north of the border. Garda files name William Frenchy Marchant, the leader of the Belfast hijackers, and Billy Fulton, the quartermaster who took charge of the explosives for Dublin and Monahan. Also named were 3 leading loyalists as the planners of the bombings. Billy Hanna, the leader of the UVF in Portadown. Harris Boyle, his second-in-command, a UVF major. And a loyalist killer known as the Jackal, who we cannot name for legal reasons. What the Garda did not know was the name of the 4th planner. First Tuesday has discovered he was Robert McConnell, a farmer from South Armagh. All 4 were former or serving members of the British Army's biggest regiment, the UDR. Within weeks, the Garda had a list of 20 suspects for the bombings. In the early stages of the investigation, the Garda enjoyed good cooperation from the RUC. Armed with their list of suspects, the team of detectives headed north, hoping to interview them and have them arrested by the RUC. But at RUC headquarters in Belfast, the trail ran cold. The Garda were not able to interview the bomb suspects or the owners of the hijacked cars, even with the RUC present. All they could do was hand over their information and wait. They were to be disappointed.
You were dealing with a Protestant force, and there was definitely a lack of cooperation. Our investigation had to end because we couldn't get any further in the north. The well just ran dry.
Chief Superintendent John Paul McMahon, who led the Monaghan murder hunt, wrote in his final report, "These investigations were greatly hampered by reason of the fact that no direct inquiries could be made in the area where the crime originated. There was no access to potential witnesses in Northern Ireland, and there was also the disadvantage of not having been able to interrogate likely suspects and put them on identification parades." And his counterpart in Dublin, Chief Superintendent John Joy, stated in his final report, "Inquiries in regard to Mulholland and the others are being made by the RUC, and results of the investigation will be reported. There is no record on the Garda file that the RUC ever did report back," says one senior officer.
It's incredible that we don't have more details about what the RUC did in our files. Even our final report, they list the suspects but don't say if they were questioned or arrested. That's astonishing.
We were in a position to bring them to court. On the life of my grandsons, I'm telling you, we could have had them.
In fact, the RUC had conducted their own inquiries north of the border. We've spoken to 2 of their special branch officers who were detailed to find out more about the bombings. They confirmed they had a list of UVF suspects which tallied with the Garda's. They reported their information to RUC headquarters, but were never asked to interview or arrest any of the suspects. Isolated in the north, the Garda team could only report back to their political masters in the hope that the Irish government would take up the issue. The Garda investigation had nowhere else to go. After only 3 months, it was quietly wound down. But our independent inquiries in loyalist circles produced a list of 20 UVF members suspected of taking part in the bombing. Their names appeared on the RUC and Garda suspect lists, and they confirmed that the bomb plot did indeed centre on Portadown, the same conclusion as the Garda and the RUC. Portadown is and was in 1974 a haven for loyalist paramilitaries. Many acts of terrorism were planned in this network of streets by the Mid-Ulster Brigade of the UVF. But did Portadown's loyalist paramilitaries really have the capability to bomb Dublin in 1974? Captain Fred Holroyd spent 1974 in Portadown working undercover for Army Intelligence and MI6. He had personal contacts with many of the Portadown bomb suspects.
At that time, the loyalist explosive capability was pretty limited. They mainly used double diamond kegs, beer kegs, filled with explosives, with a black powder fuse on. And they'd light the black powder fuse, disappear, this thing would burn down, detonator would go off, and the bomb would go off. They weren't as sophisticated as the IRA, who had electrical detonators, trembler devices, and all sorts of other very sophisticated bits of equipment, anti-handling devices. I mean, they were pretty primitive, basically.
But the Dublin operation was anything but primitive. It involved the use of sophisticated timing devices to detonate 3 car bombs within 90 seconds of each other. So could the Portadown loyalists really have bombed Dublin? And if they did, where did they get their newfound expertise? First Tuesday commissioned 2 leading experts to examine all the technical evidence on the bombings, including the official forensic report never previously released. Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles was formerly head of the British Army's bomb disposal network worldwide and served in Northern Ireland from 1969 to 1972.
To put one bomb on wheels together, you have to have a fair amount of training and expertise. To get 3 to go off all at the same time, you've got to have some pretty good technicians organising the timing mechanisms, for instance. The organisation of getting 3 cars into the centre of a city, all going off roughly at the same time, that smacks of some pretty good administrative ability. And whatever organisation, therefore, that was behind this outrage, you could say they were not low down on the learning curve, they were high up on it.
Commandant Patrick Triers was one of the Irish Army's top bomb disposal officers with wide experience of defusing terrorist devices.
It was a very sophisticated operation, very military type operation. The terrorist group had to be well trained to carry out this so smoothly and without a flaw.
The bombs contained 400 pounds of explosives, which detonated so efficiently there was no residue which could be traced back to source.
The fact that all the ingredients of the bombs exploded and were expended, indicating that the mix was consistent and that the expertise of the people that made up the mix was at a pretty sophisticated level. From a military point of view, it would have been considered 100% successful.
Despite the eyewitness and intelligence evidence, these experts believe it was highly unlikely that an attack of this complexity could have been mounted by Portadown loyalists.
I have no high regard of their skill in 1974. I don't think they were at a level that would equate to the sort of techniques that were used here in Dublin.
What about the loyalist history of synchronised car bombs?
I don't think there was one. In my view, they had not done this sort of thing. This is, as I say, outside their field of technology.
Have they done it since?
I don't, not to my knowledge.
Lieutenant Colonel Stiles concluded that the bombings bore the hallmark of the IRA, but when he compiled his report, he did not have access to Garda files naming all the suspects as UVF men.
If the loyalists did it, from their experience, I would find it hard to find that they could do it without being assisted by some other experienced people, because I think that they did not have the experience to carry out such a sophisticated operation at that particular time.
That's a view shared by former Garda Commissioner Eamon Doherty, one of the men who led the investigation into the bombings, and told us, "I didn't think at the time, and I don't think now, that any loyalist group could have done this on their own in 1974. I believe that if they did participate in this operation, they must have been helped." But if so, who did help the Portadown loyalists, and why has nobody been brought to account for the bombings? Lurgan, the abandoned headquarters of the British Army in County Armagh. On the 4th floor, the intelligence cell, the base in 1974 for Captain Fred Holroyd, Army Intelligence Officer for Portadown. The security forces infiltrated Portadown's loyalist terrorists to run them and their leaders as informers.
We knew who they were. I mean, there was no question about that, and we knew what they were involved in.
How well infiltrated?
Well, I would say we ran them. I mean, if you really want the truth, we were running the organisation hands off, because the leaders belonged to us.
According to Holroyd, in return for information, the Protestant informants were allowed to continue their terrorist activities unchecked.
Atrocities were allowed to be carried out by the Protestants. We knew who they were, we had information, and no action was ever taken against them. And this caused a lot of disquiet, as you can imagine.
Captain Holroyd was surprised that he was not ordered to investigate the Dublin bombings, since he was the military intelligence officer for Portadown, where the suspects were based.
I mean, I was never asked once by anybody to question my sources or to try and find out any information about this whatsoever. At the time, and immediately afterwards, there was just no interest at all. It was only quite some time after that my special branch colleague told me, in fact, who the Portadown men who were involved in this and where the cars had come from.
The Garda officers who went north had no doubt that their investigation had been blocked, says one.
Dan Murphy, who was then head of the Garda murder squad, told me in his opinion it was a deliberate policy by the RUC not to help the inquiry. But he said that someone was making the RUC act that way.
Says another.
Suppose some of the suspects were intelligence sources for the RUC Special Branch or MI5 or the British Army. Would you sacrifice them for an investigation in the south? But you do have a source like that. You protect him, even if he's killed people.
In 1974, Captain Fred Holroyd kept an official diary and intelligence notebooks. They reveal that the Portadown loyalists had 124 members, with 20% active, and they were clearly being monitored. They show that in the 2 months before Dublin, instructions in making bombs were given on Monday nights by William Hanna. William Hanna was on the list of suspects for Dublin of both the Garda and the RUC. Billy Fulton is recorded in the notebooks as collecting illegal fertilizer for explosives in the very month of the Dublin bombings. Billy Fulton again was on the suspect lists for Dublin of both the Garda and the RUC. The notebooks list 6 of the 8 men identified by eyewitnesses, including David Mulholland and Samuel Whitton, as active paramilitaries known to Army intelligence in 1974. Holroyd and other sources state that 2 of the 8 were paid informants of the security forces at the time. Lisbon, headquarters of the British Army in Northern Ireland. In 1974, one of its senior information officers was Colin Wallace. He briefed the media on the Dublin and Monahan bombings. Wallace, too, soon knew the names of the suspects.
The difficulty, I think, with the Dublin bombings is that there was really no follow-up, no major offensive, no major determination to find out whether these people had been responsible or not. And it was the lack of interest, I think, that concerned us, that it was a departure from normal procedure, because the outrageous nature of the bombing would have justified a greater interest, and that just didn't seem to be present at that time.
Wallace says he knew through intelligence briefings the names of the bomb suspects by September of 1974. 1 year later, he wrote to a former colleague naming 8 of them, including Mulholland, Hanna and McConnell. So not only did the Garda and the RUC know who the suspects were in 1974, so did the British Army and MI6. Both Holroyd's and Wallace's claims about undercover activities in Northern Ireland have attracted controversy. We have submitted Colin Wallace's letter and Captain Holroyd's notebook to a leading forensic analyst. Both documents are consistent with having been produced in 1974 and 5. Wallace's letter goes on to make an even more startling claim. He writes that some of the Dublin suspects were working closely with intelligence at that time.
I believe that that is probably members of the special duties team who were then linked to SAS personnel.
That special duties team was based in the rolling countryside of County Armagh at Castle Dillon in the grounds of a stately home. The team was a group of SAS-trained undercover soldiers who formed the most secret unit of the British Army in Northern Ireland.
And a remarkable little place. I mean, set behind an ordinary regiment of engineers in a compound of its own, guarded by civilian MOD police. And it was sort of made up of wooden huts. And in there I was shown, for example, the locker with all their spare barrels, so they could use weapons and then change the barrels and claim that they'd never shot people. I was shown their communications equipment, which was quite separate, and I suspect went straight through to Hereford and to MOD. I was shown a number of things which meant that they were funded separately and they were supported separately from regular army, uniformed army people. Now there's only one organisation who can sponsor anything like that, and that's the SAS.
The team's cover name was 4 Field Survey Troop. Officially, they were answerable to Army headquarters in Lisbon, but routinely they operated in virtual isolation. Ultimately, their chain of command led to MI5.
Here was a special duties unit that operated down there, and I approved of that. I knew that it wasn't a large organisation, and I know that it worked to Lisbon. If you're going to have a force operating like that, then it's got to be given a great deal of freedom of movement anyway, that they couldn't have through the normal army arrangements.
In 1988, the government was asked about this secret unit and replied, "The role of a Royal Engineer Field Survey is to provide or process aerial photographs, ground surveys and mapping for the Army. But we have interviewed a former member of 4 Field Survey Troop, and he painted a very different picture of its role in 1974.
We were a specialist unit with training in surveillance and anti-surveillance, silent weapons, break-in and entering. We were also trained in weapons for sabotage with explosives and assassination. We also crossed the Irish border with explosives to booby-trap arms dumps and for other missions."
I would certainly not have worried too much if they found arms buried in the ground, that they left them in a position that would cause harm to those who were going to pick them up. You know, one lives in a harsh world. But as for crossing the border, they certainly had no permission for any of it from me, and neither should they in general. But if they were going to cross the border, they would have had to have had permission from the man in charge of security, and that was me.
In 1988, the government stated that all records relating to this secret unit had been destroyed. In 1974, 4 Field Survey Troop was led by 2 key officers, Captain Tony Ball in command and Lieutenant, later Captain, Robert Nyrak. Nyrak had already spent 12 months as an undercover specialist in Northern Ireland.
Nyrak's job at Castle Dillon, when I was there, was as a source handler. He was getting intelligence and had contacts on both sides.
We have evidence from police, military and loyalist sources which confirms the links between Nyrak and the Portadown loyalist terrorists, and also that in May 1974 he was meeting with these paramilitaries, supplying them with arms and helping them plan acts of terrorism against Republican targets. In particular, that 3 prime Dublin suspects, Robert McConnell, Harris Boyle and the man called the Jackal, were run before and after the Dublin bombing by Captain Nyrak. That 3 of the Dublin bomb suspects at the time of the outrage were run by Nyrak has been confirmed to us by a series of security force sources from 1974. They include officers from RUC Special Branch, CID and Special Patrol Group, officers from the Garda Special Branch, and key senior loyalists who were in charge of the County Armagh paramilitaries of the day also confirm the Nyrak connection. But why should Nyrak and Ball involve themselves with known loyalist terrorists? The Army's own secret training manual specifies this kind of role for SAS forces when it states that they are particularly suited to liaison with an organisation training and control of friendly guerrilla forces operating against the common enemy. The friendly guerrillas in Northern Ireland were loyalist terrorists. A similar range of sources confirm that Billy Hanna, the most senior loyalist on the suspect list, was run separately as an agent by the British Army from Lisbon and 3 Brigade headquarters in Lurgan.
Loyalist paramilitaries, by and large, worked willingly with the intelligence community, ostensibly with the army, because they felt that both they and the security force were doing the same job, defeating the IRA. So in many ways, they would have been much easier to manipulate, because any work or any task given to them by the intelligence community, they would have seen almost as an honour that this would have been an extension of what they themselves were doing.
The extraordinary concept that elements in the British security forces could be involved in acts of cross-border terrorism was not new. In 1972, two English brothers, Keith and Kenneth Littlejohn, were arrested for robbing a Dublin bank. Their campaign included firebombing Irish police stations and blaming the IRA to provoke tougher Irish government action against them. The Littlejohns maintained that they were MI6 agents acting under orders. The British Ministry of Defence later confirmed the Littlejohn connection to MI6. Then in December 1972, two car bombs exploded in Dublin, killing 2 people, as the Irish Parliament was debating new anti-terrorist laws. The Irish opposition was against the measures, but now voted for them, believing the IRA had planted the bombs. Yet within weeks, rumours that the British were responsible were rife. Even Jack Lynch, the Irish Prime Minister at the time of the bombs, suspected British involvement.
Well, my suspicions naturally are aroused more. We have no, as I said, indication who was responsible. And as is now well known, a lot of people in Ireland believe that many of these unexplained activities and actions could well be related to British intelligence or other activities of that nature.
2 days after Mr. Lynch's statement, the Garda leaked a file on the 1972 bombings to the Dublin Evening Herald. The file's conclusion that the car bombs were the work of the British Army's SAS.
The 1972 Dublin bombing was the work of the SAS. There's no doubt about it. They were such convenient bombs with the Dáil debate going on. That's probably why the article appeared. There was a lot of frustration about the SAS role and our inability to do anything about it.
In his report for First Tuesday on the 1974 car bombings of Dublin and Monaghan, Lieutenant Colonel George Stiles, the head of Army bomb disposal in Northern Ireland in 1972, said, "It could be a covert military operation by UK armed forces," but added, "In my view, which is based on experience of such operations, this is extremely unlikely. But did such operations mean the British Army covertly detonated their own bombs?"
I don't think without breaking the Official Secrets Act, or getting somebody to break it, you're ever going to get any information about every operation that goes on covertly. No. Whether it involves setting a bomb off or whether it doesn't.
I understand that, but you see, where it says here it would be unthinkable for a covert operation such as this to use other than captured IRA materials, that suggests to me that the military were undertaking covert operations using captured IRA explosives.
No, I think I would say if somebody said to me, we want you to set off a bang tonight so that we can go and have a look at whatever, and because the bang would be allied to an IRA explosion and therefore wouldn't be other than a normal occurrence, it would be unthinkable to an operation such as that to use other than captured IRA materials.
But for us to set off a bang, we're still setting explosives.
Yes.
So the British military were carrying out explosives.
Well, they could have been. No reason why they shouldn't, if that was a way of getting information.
So, according to Lieutenant Colonel Stiles, in the early 1970s, the British Army in Northern Ireland was planting and exploding bombs in populated areas so that soldiers could search evacuated premises for information. These bombs were then blamed on terrorist groups.
I don't believe that it was difficult under the law to go into areas to search if they had reason to believe that there were arms or bomb kits to be found. I don't believe that one needed a bomb that I presume was going to be set not to kill anybody to go in. And for whatever reason, I believe it's a grave mistake for that to be done.
George Stiles left Northern Ireland in 1972, having received the George Cross for heroism. There is no suggestion that he or his team had anything to do with cross-border bombs. Lieutenant Colonel Stiles discounts the possibility that the 1974 bombing of Dublin and Monaghan was a covert British military operation.
Oh, certainly it wasn't. I can't see that happening at all. You see, if you're talking about 1974, I can say definitely that it wasn't. Or certainly it wasn't carried out by the part of the organisation that I represented.
That some elements of the British security forces had been involved in the Dublin atrocity is maintained by a senior source in the RUC Special Branch, by 5 senior Portadown paramilitaries, and by Captain Holroyd and Colin Wallace.
The belief, certainly by certain people at Army headquarters in Lisburn, was that some of the explosive used in the Dublin bombings had been provided from security force sources. And that was security forces in the widest sense, which could mean from the RUC, from the UDR, or from the Army. It wasn't specific, but there was a genuinely held belief that that had been the case. And that the planning and some of the organising of that operation had been done with the assistance of people who were working within the security community.
But why should even the most extreme elements in the British security forces want to play a role in bombing the South? In December 1973, the Sunningdale Agreement was signed. It established power sharing in the North and gave Dublin its first political role in Northern Ireland. The Protestants rebelled. Loyalist paramilitaries stepped up their campaign of sectarian killing. Then in February 1974, Harold Wilson's minority government came to power. Some feared that Labour would move towards a united Ireland and go soft on the IRA. According to Wallace, this alarmed elements in British intelligence, fearing that their war against the IRA would be undermined.
I suppose they regarded the election of a Labour government as a major threat to the Irish situation. The Army seemed, in the early days, much less involved, but I think they became increasingly concerned by statements made by senior Labour people about possible withdrawal from Northern Ireland.
By April, Merlin Rees, the Northern Ireland Secretary, was still promoting Sunningdale, planning to phase out internment, cut troop numbers, and hand over the Army's security control to the police. Merlin Rees believes his 1974 policies were being undermined by a subversive faction in Army intelligence.
It was a unit, a section out of control. There's no doubt it reflected the views of a number of soldiers. Let's go in and fix this lot and so on. But that it went on, and that it went on from Lisbon, and it went on from the Army Information Service and those associated with it, I have no doubt at all.
On May the 15th, Loyalist resentment boiled over. The Ulster workers' strike brought the province to a standstill. On the strike's third day, the Dublin and Monahan bombs exploded. For those who opposed the Republic's new role in the North and saw the South as a safe haven for the IRA, the bombs gave Dublin and its politicians a taste of the carnage already suffered in Northern Ireland for 5 years. Within 2 weeks, the Loyalists had destroyed much of the political will in Dublin and London. Sunningdale was dead. Nevertheless, in 3 months, the Irish police had the names of 20 prime suspects, 8 of whom were identified by eyewitnesses. Yet a year later, the Irish government told its parliament that the Garda had no positive information with which to identify the bombers. Today, all the ministers on the Irish government's Security Committee, interviewed by First Tuesday, say they were never told the Garda had any suspects for the bombings.
While our society is menaced by men who perpetrate cowardly acts of violence, the Gardaí and the Army will give the citizens all the protection they can. Their ability to...
We asked former Irish Prime Minister Cosgrave what pressure he'd put on the British authorities to trace the bombers and if he knew his police force had a list of suspects. He declined to answer any questions about the bombings. Suspect William Fulton, the UVF's Portadown quartermaster, was captured 1 month after the Dublin bombings. He was imprisoned in Scotland for carrying explosives, but was never arrested for Dublin and died in 1989. Suspect William Frenchy Marchant, the man named in the Garda files as the leader of the car hijackers, was assassinated by the IRA in 1987 and given a full UVF paramilitary funeral. Suspect Harris Boyle died a year after the Dublin bombings, killed at the Miami show band Massacre by his own bomb. He too received a UVF military send-off. Suspect Billy Hanna, who won the military medal with the British Army in Korea, was shot dead in 1975 by fellow loyalists suspected of leaking UVF information to a rival section of British intelligence. Suspect Robert McConnell was shot dead by the IRA in April 1976 while serving as a corporal in the Ulster Defence Regiment. At his funeral, he was described as a man who worked ceaselessly for peace. Suspect Samuel Whitten is serving life for a sectarian murder and 14 years for arms possession. Other Dublin suspects remain free. There's no record of any being arrested or charged with the greatest massacre of the Troubles. Suspect David Alexander Mulholland left Portadown in 1975. He's now believed to be living somewhere in England. And the man known as the Jackal was left free to carry out some of the worst atrocities of the Troubles.
I'm absolutely astonished to hear that there was detailed information about those who'd been involved in Dublin. Certainly it wasn't notified to me, and if it had, to hell with any problems that there might be with the Garda, suspicion of the South, and all that. If names were given and the names were in the North, it would be my job, without ever interfering in day-to-day security matters, to make clear that something's got to be done within the rule of law, that these people should be questioned and, if needs be, dealt with by the full process of law.
Each year, a memorial service is held in Dublin on May the 17th to honour the victims of the bombing. Their relatives are joined by uniform and special branch officers who monitor the gathering.
It's like taking a big lump of your life away, isn't it? Especially your first grandchildren,
How do you feel about the people who inflicted this on your family?
Well, I don't know how they sleep in the night, but they were only carrying out orders. But they were very bad orders to carry out. I'd feel 100% better if this government done something and get these fellas on trial and let them get their sentence, and that'll make me happy. Because they're not killing a hell of a lot of people, and they shouldn't be let out with it. And this government definitely does know who done it.
When I go to the cemetery and I visit that grave, how can I not feel for that man that's in that? How can I not feel for the 5 children that were left behind and the baby that was stillborn after it? they are listening to this programme and they know they're responsible and they have a family, I hope and I pray that God will keep them together, that they will not, their families will not go through what our families up here went through.
For 19 years I've lived just referring to these bombers as bombers. I've never seen a face. I can't understand why any human being would go out and inflict so much destruction and death on his fellow human being. I mean, my father was an innocent man, so were the rest of the people who died. Justice is all I want to see done, for them to be brought back down to Dublin and to stand trial for what they did.
Robert Nairac continued to serve in Northern Ireland, maintaining his contacts with loyalist paramilitaries. He was murdered by the IRA in 1977 while on an undercover mission and posthumously awarded the George Cross. His commanding officer at Castle Dillon, Tony Ball, was awarded the Military Cross for his undercover work. He died in 1981. The Castle Dillon base was closed down in 1975, but the Special Duties Team, which now goes under the name of 14th Intelligence, lives on in Northern Ireland, the most secret unit of the British Army based there. Today, the Jackal is still one of the UVF's most active gunmen. He's said to have killed at least 30 people. In one murder case, he was named in court as the actual killer, but the RUC had never interviewed him about the crime. During the trial, an RUC superintendent was asked why. The officer replied, it was a matter of operational strategy. Many believe the Jackal was not charged with this and many other killings because he was and is protected by the security forces of Northern Ireland.
The Royal Ulster Constabulary did not want to take part in our programme. A spokesman said they had provided factual evidence and intelligence to the Irish police. The relatives of the dead and injured are now calling for an investigation, and First Tuesday will cooperate with any properly constituted public inquiry. We'll be back in August. Until then, good night.